This is 2020 cool.
We're losing our democracy! Wake up! Wake up!
2020 was the year that the whole world got locked inside. There was nothing you could do but sit on your computer for work, for leisure. You could only play games and watch movies and browse the internet. It feels like some karmic punishment then. That's also the year that the internet turned to shit, games sucked, and the movies were just awful. But we kinda need to talk about what the hell happened. Because now the dust has settled a bit. It's a bit in the past behind us. Most of you will still remember it fairly well. But I think some people are starting to forget quite how egregious things were back then. And now I think we're more free to talk about what the hell actually happened that year. Because that year you couldn't really talk very honestly. I'm sure many of you will remember. Basically, we need to talk about whatever the fuck that was. And whenever it's brought up, there's a lot of people who don't really want to talk about it or discuss it. They want to put it behind us. They want us to forget. For me, I think the reason they want to do that is because they're embarrassed. They're embarrassed about who they were, about what they became during that time, about the things they said and did and supported. Remember at the very start, it was 2 weeks to flatten the curve. Obviously, the coronavirus pandemic was really the defining element of that era in history. Everyone was talking about how they're so tired of living through historic events, and they affected our society in a lot of ways that, frankly, I think we're still reeling from. I think in a lot of ways, some people got, I'm going to be honest, permanently fucked up by that time period and what happened to them during that time period. And frankly, I think there's a lot more we need to do to recover. And I think there's a lot of kind of precipices that we passed during that time that we can't really go back to. We can't go back to the before times. One of the things I remember during that time was because everyone was on the internet, suddenly the entire internet became noticeably bigger. One of the most obvious things was you'd see posts online, on YouTube, on Twitter, on everything, far more regularly getting upwards of 100,000 likes and tens of thousands of comments sometime. It was also a time when governments were far more active and special interest groups, so you'd see a lot of fake engagement as well, and I think bot activity, fake online activity really ramped up during that time. And that's when people started theorizing about the dead internet theory. And I mean, it's pretty accurate because a lot of the internet at that time was basically just fake. And frankly, I think it's only gotten worse now. The obvious example here is the botted likes. And that hasn't gone away since then, but definitely exploded during that time. Now, of course, there were really a lot of things that happened at the time, but besides the coronavirus pandemic, the other defining political phenomenon of the time was, of course, the BLM riots and the protests. And what's so distinct about them is how they kind of took over all of society. See, one change I noticed during that time is you could no longer be apolitical. To be apolitical, you kind of marked yourself for a lot of people as the enemy. And people tried to force you into a position. And they tried to force their friends and families into either supporting them or antagonizing them. A lot of people became very combative. They said, if you're neutral in the face of injustice, you are part of the problem. And I saw that rhetoric mostly from the left. And I would say in the long run, that rhetoric has backfired quite dramatically because, of course, they did force people into political positions. However, not everyone who was forced into a political position actually ended up agreeing with them. A lot of people who were either silent or apolitical or neutral ended up being negatively polarized against them and against their causes. This has caused a lot of the shifts I think we've seen in the years since. One of the most memorable parts of this kind of political era was the whole BLM phenomenon, where people essentially saw it as a social event. They wanted to take part in a trend, and especially considering we had the lockdowns at the time, that I think boosted the attendance at these protests. The way some people acted online at this time was crazy. These people who would put the BLM fist on their face was memorable, so entertaining. Or the people who fantasized really quite wildly about oppression. They imagined they were in the 50s and their black friend was being taken away, or their Jewish friend was being taken from them in the 30s. They had so many people develop this crazy guilt complex, which is just ridiculous. And a lot of people did get suckered in. They really did believe the whole rhetoric about justice and about the good fight. Frankly, I think people falling for that at the time is why so many people have kind of turned against that since.
Why are you... We're on your side! We're on your side! Holy shit! We're on your side!
They didn't know what these riots were really about, or why, frankly, a lot of people were attending. I will say, not everyone there was a good faith actor. I'll say that much. There was a statistic going around at the time that something like 7% of all the protests are violent, so the majority are peaceful. And that's stupid for so many reasons. One, because 7% is like a really bad number anyway. Like, that is a really high number of people who are being violent within a protest. And if there's millions of people, that means there's thousands of people roaming the street violently. Second of all, because they were part of a protest, they were essentially protected from the police and could kind of act with impunity. And there were a lot of deaths during this time. A lot of deaths that can quite squarely be pinned on the protests. There was a surge in things like murders around the time. Things got bad. And it seemed like every single institution of society joined in on this one movement at the time. Like, we're glad that we have McDonald's and KFC on our side. You see, if McDonald's didn't tell me to stop killing trans black women, I wouldn't even know what to think. But you know what? I'm going to say a moral position. If you need McDonald's to tell you to be good, maybe you just aren't a good person. There was Call of Duty that had the whole blackout event where you couldn't play. They had CNN on the movie theater in Fortnite, and then they had tomatoes as well that you could throw at the screen. A bunch of people joined in. Like I said, it was treated like a trend. People put the black square on Instagram. But some people got really into it to a ridiculous level. There was people taking out statues of George Floyd. They had idols of him. They were depicting him as saints. They were attributing miracles to him. It basically, for a lot of people, became a cult. You know, it's said, and this is a maxim that is just true, you couldn't do anything in 2020. You weren't allowed to do anything because you would have obsessed teenage K-pop fans jumping down your throat as soon as they took even the slightest issue with the most minuscule thing you said. And you might have no idea you were being offensive, and it was really, really very easy to do at that time. Like, basically your livelihood and future depended on whether or not depressed teenagers with K-pop pictures liked what you said. Like, we don't realize how many people were getting taken down at this time. It wasn't just white supremacists or whatever. It was the most milquetoast people. It was the most milquetoast conservatives. Often even apolitical influences were just getting deleted. People were dropping like flies at this time. Like, they removed the PogChamp emote on Twitch, for example. That's a good milestone for this era, because that was the most popular emote on Twitch. But he said something that the Twitch staff disagreed with politically, so they took him down and they took his channel offline. So no more PogChamp. And I don't think it ever came back, did it? These mobs would go around and they'd try to force everyone with enough influence to have a take, and they had to be forced into this opinion. And a lot more people became polarized away from, you know, being apolitical. Not even apolitical, but rather not politically vocal. And I'm going to say, not everyone should be politically vocal. I think there is enough noise in politics. I think if somebody is going to say something, it should only be really the people who are informed enough and who actually feel the need to really say something. It should be the people who are, at the very least, passionate about a certain topic or issue. I don't know why at this time they're trying to force people into having these opinions. And of course they'd jump down your throat if you had the wrong opinion. Do you remember when people got cancelled for using the wrong skin tone on their emojis in 2020? Or do you remember this girl who got cancelled for saying cute space buns? It was actually as ridiculous, perhaps even more ridiculous than you remember. And some people are going to try and downplay it, but it really was that bad. I remember things like this. The people who looted around here in Richmond are selfish, and they're not for the cause. They're just there for no reason whatsoever, just to steal. Don't you dare call yourself a protester. So this is someone who supports the cause. This is somebody who is basically in agreement with them. They just don't agree with violence and looting and unfollow. Not seen one tweet from you in support of protesters or George Floyd. This is what it was like at the time. It was pure insanity. That is why people who have nostalgia for old Twitter are psychos. And it's why I do not trust them. And that brings me into another point. There are people who are legitimately nostalgic for that time period. They look back on that time period fondly, which is unbelievable to me. It was the worst year in living memory. For most people, for a lot of people, it just sucked. And frankly, the people who want things to be like that again, they are the enemy. They are my enemy. They say, let's get more woke now. We need to bring back 2020 wokeness. No, we don't. We need to banish that into hell forever. There are people who are acting like back in 2020, people were doing what they really wanted to. They were just baking sourdough and they were just having fun. They were free. No, they weren't. People were depressed and miserable and became far more mentally ill and fucked up during that time. Because what about if one of the things you like doing is going outside, going to the gym or going to church or socializing? People were not their true selves. People turned into a dark reflection of themselves in that time period. And frankly, we're still in recovery mode. Another part of this whole censorship issue, does anybody remember what AOC said? Is anyone archiving these Trump sycophants for when they try to downplay or deny their complicity in the future? I foresee decent probability of many deleted tweets, writings, photos in the future. They were treating that shit like it was the Holocaust. Like, it's unbelievable. Do you remember? It's crazy how deleting Trump's Twitter had no downsides whatsoever. It's so funny how many of the tweets from this time and the opinions have aged so ridiculously bad. Because obviously nowadays, a lot of people's proximity to power is literally hinged on how close they stood to Trump at the time. The greatest irony of this AOC tweet is that this ended up getting deleted. And it wasn't super easy for me to find, like I had to track it down. So this is something that frankly she wants you to forget about. And this is what I was alluding to earlier. A lot of these people, they want you to forget about who they were and what they became during this time period. That's kind of part of why I'm bringing it up again, because we shouldn't forget. And another point I was alluding to before, everything sucked. TV sucked, games sucked, movies sucked. Every game that came out at the time was broken. Every game was unfinished at the time. This was like at the peak of live service. So the companies that were poised with live service games at the time, they made a killing. Everything else just turned to absolute dog shit. Cyberpunk, that sucked. Do you remember that episode of Family Guy with Trump? There has never been a good Trump parody or take on Trump in film or TV. Every time they try to do Trump, it just sucks. Because they're so obviously made from malice. Most of these impressions. And you know, the culture changed for the worse as well. Like I said, everything sucked. Memes were not funny. For one, you weren't allowed to be funny because if you were too funny, you'd get banned. But they also took on such a strange dimension. There was Among Us, for example. I think that was truly the original friend slup. And it blew up around that time because, well, obviously people were lacking in social connection, so they wanted something to fill in the void. And so Among Us memes were huge, and in retrospect they weren't that funny. Well, they were occasionally funny, but they weren't that great. What else was popular? Dream became popular. I mean, I guess he had decently edited videos, but frankly it was common for influencers, for YouTubers at that time to kind of cultivate a ton of audience capture, which means a very dedicated audience, but also one that will absolutely eat you alive and will cancel you, which we saw happen. And it happened actually countless times to a bunch of people. And frankly, that's true of a lot of people who got big in 2020. And there's people still around now, and if they did get big in 2020, and that's when they really grew the most and blew up, I don't trust them, because there's always something wrong with them. Like, that was the time period that you grew. They always have either some weird parasocial relationship with their audience, or they're super suck-ups and they're very big on censorship. There's always some kind of problem with them. So I don't know, frankly, about really any kind of online figure who got big in 2020.
Okay, I'm recording this under different circumstances because I don't have my setup, but I feel I had to include this in the video. Another meme people often forget about is the Karen meme. See, as it started out, it was mocking, I would say, a real phenomenon, one that I noticed, which was these entitled middle-aged women who do always want to get their way and have tantrums. And I think the meme got popular before the pandemic, but then over the pandemic, it kind of got pushed everywhere and it took on a different character. All of a sudden, Karen was somebody who refused to wear their mask, or somebody who says all lives matter instead of Black Lives Matter. So you can see how things took kind of an insidious twist. It became especially popular on Reddit, where, you know, there was a lot of fake activity at the time. Remember, there was that Air Force base that was conspicuously located in an area where there was a ton of Reddit traffic going on. So yeah, something to think about, how the memes you consume are sometimes pushing an agenda.
Another thing that I noticed got huge is things like femboy memes and like trans memes and a lot of porn memes as well. And I think a lot of those things are related to something I call the toaster fucker effect. This is something that you're probably aware of, and if you're not, it's this post where back in the past, if you want to fuck toasters, you can get told that you're an idiot and you don't fuck toasters. Nowadays though, you want to fuck toasters, you go online, find r/toasterfucker community. Now, you are obsessed with fucking toasters and you get so deep in it and you keep digging yourself into that hole. And suddenly you end up thinking everybody fucks toasters and it's actually normal to fuck toasters and everybody else really wants to do it. If they're not overt about it, they secretly want to do it. And well, at least 50% of the population's into it, it feels like, you know. So that was true this time because obviously a lot of people played games and they went on the internet and stuff as well. A lot of people obviously got really into porn because if you're locked inside all day, those are the things you can really do. So that's why I think porn memes and femboy memes became massive. And a lot of people became cross-dressers and femboys at this time, probably because they were locked inside so much. They developed this fetish. And frankly, the memes, I think, are something that introduced people to that. So a lot of these memes really were a cry for help in retrospect. There were people who were really being groomed into online communities and really just raping their own mind, obliterating their own mind with porn and with porn communities and porn memes. And that's especially one of the points where I don't think we've entirely recovered culturally from it yet, because a lot of people, frankly, are still like that. But yeah, 2020 was when it blew up. Another thing inexplicably that became big, besides just porn, was another type of echo chamber, which is communism. A lot of people got really into communism at this time. They were saying things like, how can you even make it through 2020 without being communist? And it felt kind of random and kind of sudden. Like all of a sudden, everybody was a communist. You'd see these kind of posts online and these videos and these stories and topics and articles that were suddenly very sympathetic to communism. Part of this obviously was that conservative views, even milquetoast ones, were being censored quite heavily at the time. And frankly, I think social media platforms were allowing generally left-wing views at the time. Now, I don't think these platforms are run by communists. I don't think they're explicitly communist, but they were motivated by, for example, a desire to fight the alt-right or something, and undermine so-called right-wing disinformation without kind of realizing what was happening under their noses, which was allowing really an extreme far-left community to grow right under their noses. And a lot of these posts obviously had fake engagement. Like they had a very small amount of comments relative to the amount of likes they had, because obviously likes are easier to fake. Like if you believe that everything online was real and you weren't constantly being astroturfed, you'd think suddenly everyone became a communist. Let's say like, hi, I'm a communist, and everyone would be like, yay. Because, well, to be fair, if you came in and said you disagree, people would try to dox you and get you fired from your job. You were told communism is bad by people who said slavery was good. Like, that is such a stupid and ridiculous point to make. Like, no, I don't even need to be told that communism is bad to know it's bad. I just need to know certain facts that were proven by history. And then we really need to address how things got so extreme in the first place. Remember, the lockdown was so severe, especially in Australia. I mean, you couldn't go to the gym, go to church. You couldn't exercise outside without a mask, even if you weren't near anybody else. They had these detention camps for people to make sure no one with COVID gets in. It was ridiculous and extreme, and it went way beyond what was necessary. It was very clearly in retrospect that we were being ruled by fear, by people who really had no clue what they were doing, and they were constantly invoking the nebulous experts, the invisible, faceless medical experts who justify every single decision they made and every single limitation on your freedom. And the strange thing that was unique as an Australian was other people's attitudes. There were a lot of people who were very critical of the lockdowns and didn't support the measures, but they were actually quite resentful of the anti-lockdown protesters for some reason. Despite them opposing the thing they were supporting, they took out their anger instead of on the government that was actually enacting these measures. They took them out and their frustration and resentment on the people who were protesting against these measures. For some reason, they had this misplaced resentment. At this time as well, a lot of politicians, despite being really harsh against the general public and the average person, for example, in the UK, they considered killing pet cats for some reason. Likely they didn't go through with it, but the fact that it was even considered is insane. A lot of these politicians went crazy, but despite being so strict, they weren't strict on the BLM protesters and BLM rioters. In fact, in Australia, protesting was effectively banned. You weren't allowed to publicly gather to protest at all. It was just illegal. Except for one that was permitted, and that was the BLM protest, which is just unbelievable. The fact that our government decided, yeah, this is the cause that people are allowed to protest for, and the others, they don't have free speech. They're not allowed to. They're criminals, and they should be brutalized. Beyond that, one of the reasons this matters to me so much, and why it has for so long, is because of a personal story. You see, my grandma was sick in hospital at the time, and due to the lockdown measures, I wasn't actually allowed to visit her in hospital because I wasn't a direct relative. I was a grandchild, not a child. Now, of course, I could have gotten around it by perhaps lying to the hospital and saying that I was a child, but obviously there's a major issue there because, yeah, that solution would have required me to lie to the hospital. So it matters to me a lot, and frankly, I think Australians were surprisingly lax about something that, to be honest, they really shouldn't have been lax about. They should have kicked up more of a stink about what happened during this time period. Ultimately, like when I talk to people and I tell them how much I hated that period in time, they would say things something along the lines of, well, we all went through the same thing. We all experienced that. And we were fine, we live with it, we got through it. And I think, frankly, that's the issue. I think the issue is the fact that we went through the same thing and you didn't see that much of an issue with it. And you, frankly, think things are fine now. And we just got through it. First of all, how do we know something like that won't happen again? What happens when the next crisis comes around? Are you just going to give up your freedom again? That is the problem. The fact that you were fine with everything that happened is the problem. But anyway, that's my personal rant done. Ultimately, it's important to remember this period in time because people changed. People changed a lot, and people who you thought you knew switched up, and there was someone else entirely. And frankly, it's not just people you knew personally, it was the whole society that you lived amongst. It felt like you were living somewhere else than what you knew up to that point. So yeah, thank you guys for watching. Hashtag never forget. So remember to subscribe and support me on Patreon. Thank you guys all so much for watching, and goodbye.